I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water.
It's about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
Join movement expert Aaron Alexander as he dives into the minds of the foremost innovative healthcare thinkers on their approach to optimal health and wellness. Align Podcast.
Welcome back to Align Podcast. My name is Aaron Alexander. Today's beautiful episode was with Mr. John Romaniello. John is a New York Times best-selling author. He is a writing coach. He is a fitness, master coach. He's been in the fitness industry forever and highly regarded expert in that realm. And overall, super insightful fella, as you guys are about to find out. This conversation goes deep into depression and anxiety and sexuality and all sorts of really interesting annals of thought. So I hope you guys really enjoy. Thank you so much for tuning into the website, alignpodcast.com, ALIGN Highly recommend folks starting the 5-day movement challenge. Super simple, 5 fundamental movement practices that everybody ought to be integrating into their daily life will be sent your way. So jump on to alignpodcast.com and you check that thing out. I really greatly appreciate y'all leaving reviews on the iTunes. Thank you so much for doing that. I read every single one and it means the world. Also helps the algorithms know that people are paying attention to this thing. So thank you for doing that. You do it on your phone or your computer or whatever is good for you. Last big thanks is to Four Sigmatic for supporting this podcast. Four Sigmatic is a company that I've been using for the last 2 and change years or so, and it is therapeutic medicinal mushrooms in delicious packets in the form of cocos and teas, and they even do chocolates and now protein smoothies. Just really great stuff. I actually legitimately use it whether they sponsor me or not. And that's why it's so convenient that we can bring it to you at a discount. So you can utilize foursigmatic.com/align. Use the align code and you'll get 15% off your purchase. FOUR Sigmatic, SIGMATIC.com/align. And jump on there for a discount. So yeah, I recommend the reishi mushrooms before going to bed. I recommend cordyceps before working out. Lion's mane's good for the brain. Whatever you're into. I think we're good. I really greatly appreciate y'all tuning in. I hope you enjoy this podcast. If you do, feel free to reach out to me or John on the Instagrams. And love to hear from you. All right, here we go. Back to the show with Mr. John Romaniello. Pow.
Align Podcast.
I'm getting back into, honestly, weekly movement. Making sure I do yoga once a week.
Dope. What kind of yoga are you doing?
I'm currently doing Kundalini. So I've
good. You're getting weird.
I'm super weird. Yeah.
That's good. Are you are you having hot red revival, Holy Spirit,
no.
Kundalini risings or anything?
No, nothing like that.
Okay.
We'll see how weird it gets.
Yeah, right. That's good. What do you think? What are your thoughts on Kundalini so far?
Everything is weird.
Yeah.
In life, I don't know. My thoughts are that when it's well explained, it makes sense. The way anything else makes sense if it's well explained. But I am enjoying it more than the faux inspirational sort of LA style yoga that people seem to gravitate towards when it's a predominantly physical practice that has a sheen of spirituality on top of it. I don't love that.
Yeah.
But this seems solid.
So what is your background in bodybuilding and such, and why did you get into it in the first place? What was the
impetus there?
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, how deep do you want to go?
Deep.
The story, the canon, the legend of Roman is true. It's not untrue. It's that I was a chubby kid historically, and then sophomore year of college, just had this sort of call to adventure moment where I looked in the mirror, and I'd been getting very chubby because I was never a truly athletic kid. But I looked in the mirror and didn't love what I saw in that same way many people have that experience. And I couldn't reconcile the person I was internally with the person I appeared to be externally. And, there's a lot of research that just shows the way we've been socialized to look at bodies. We look at people who are overweight and we believe that they are less intelligent, that they are of less value, et cetera. So detaching from all of those things over time, took work, but those apply doubly to ourselves. And I was like, all right, I don't like this look. And so I dove in, driven mostly by vanity and, a desire for self-love, which is underlying self-loathing, to get in shape. That's the legend. Chubby kid gets fit, changes my life, gets into fitness, eventually gets into bodybuilding, etc. But the stuff that I had never really talked to about or spoken about or really even admitted to most people was that a lot of the underlying reason for wanting to be big and strong was to feel safe. As a child of a survivor of physical abuse, and then I would later find out, much later in my life, I would uncover childhood sexual abuse. It seems very clear to me now, having the perspective, that so much of my desire to be big and strong was to feel safe. Firstly, if you are of a certain size, that is a deterrent physically from anyone who might hurt you, but then also wanting to feel capable of handling threat was a driving force. And then if you even remove and go one layer deeper into the psychology of it, when you are someone who is abused, particularly when you're young, and it's an area that you have no control of, you have no control over your environment, you have no control over the things you're seeing or experiencing, and you have, in a very real sense, somebody is taking away your control over your own body. And so I think that there's this driving force in many people, particularly young men who are survivors of childhood sexual assault, to seek control over their body. And fitness, bodybuilding, that was a way to create that manifestation. That, if you can bend and mold your corporeal form to your will, that is a type of control. Controlling your diet, controlling your physique. These are ways to reclaim something that had been taken from me when I was young. And so those are all the deeper underlying things about which, I didn't speak for all my years in the fitness industry. And now, with all the therapy and the psychedelics and all the journeying, they become, firstly, easier to talk about and to admit to myself. But then secondly, I'm, putting those pieces together is much simpler.
How did you go about uncovering the sexual trauma? Had it been repressed or?
Oh, completely repressed, which is such an interesting thing. Real repression is very rare. And it makes for very interesting TV drama. It's a nice plot point and like Amnesia. But it rarely happens. And when it's uncovered, it is usually not internal, it's external, which is to say that if there are things that have been done to you when you're a child, it's usually some other person in your life that begins to reveal this to you. Someone mentions something, and that sort of opens the jar. In my particular case, I happened to stumble across a thread of a memory while I was on MDMA. It was my second experience with MDMA. This was not therapeutic MDMA. I was just rolling for fun. And I was having this conversation with a friend of a friend that turned kind of deep. And it was a story about my childhood. My father is very, very abusive to me physically. And when you tell a story about childhood abuse and, you see people's reactions, and this is something that happens over time in all victims of abuse, that we try to downplay it for other people. And so you develop this way of talking about it. And so, I would have this when people would ask and I was comfortable discussing, I'd have this story, this way. And as a storyteller, I teach storytelling. You develop this rhythm where you are comfortable telling the story and you always have the same notes and you hit the same beats. And my father's physical abuse of me was pretty serious, and that I had wound up with a cracked skull at one point, and I only have 60% capacity in my right lung because he had broken my ribs at one point, and I had a collapsed lung, which has all sorts of effects on my physicality to this day. I'm not a great swimmer because I'm not buoyant. in any event, I'm on MDMA. I'm having this conversation with someone, and the beat I always hit at the end of revealing this to a person was, I mean, it could have been so much worse. At least I didn't get raped, which is kind of a really weird fucking punchline. But it, you know, it creates context for people that like, okay, I understand that as bad as it was, it could have been much worse for me. And as this came out of my mouth, and I said, well, at least I didn't get raped, there was a part of me that woke up and realized, like, that is actually not true, I don't think. Wow. And then the next MDMA journey was sooner than it should have been. I normally like to take like several months between, but this was about maybe 5 weeks later because I wanted to do the digging. And I began to have some memories surface. And then I, you know, through therapy, was able to start pulling out more and more and more. And it was devastating because there's so much of this trauma that is fresh. Having processed all of the physical abuse on the part of my father, it's like all of these things that have happened, they're like shards of shattered glass, right? It's this piece of you that is broken by someone else. And to process it, you have to pick up these pieces and look at them and examine them and see what they mean or could have meant or mean in context. And the more you do that, both time and exposure, but also the handling, it dulls the edges of that glass. And so talking about my father, I know how to handle, I know the shape, I know how to avoid getting cut. But this new thing that I had unearthed, it was like just reaching into a bag and just coming out with a lacerated hand every time because it was also fresh. And it was so interesting that I'd suppressed it for like 26, 27 years. So, you know, these instances of sexual abuse had occurred from the time I was around 6 to 8 at the hands of a great uncle. And having those conversations with anyone, it really was difficult because it was like fresh trauma that I was just unearthing. And as hard as it was to start moving through that in the initial stages, I will say that it was a relief of a sort in that it began to help me explain a lot of my behaviors. And it didn't fix them, you know. It did not in any way help me change the behaviors or break the patterns that I needed to break. That was something that I needed to be worked through independently. But at least it began to give me some awareness of why I had the fears that I did, or why I behaved the way that I did, or ran from the things that I did. And that over time gives you it informs the way you need to approach things therapeutically.
Is there any standout modalities or approaches or practices or things or movements or words or anything that helped gain relationship with those experiences?
I mean, you know, the therapeutic modalities that with which I've had the most success are CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, didn't work for me the way I would have wanted it to. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that when I was really in it, I was not as aware of the traumas as I should have been, or at the very least, I had not reconciled as much as I needed to in terms of really admitting the things that had happened or the things that I had done. So dialectical behavioral therapy has been far more helpful, DBT. And that is great. And then in addition, you know, I know that there is whatever attachment people might have to hearing the use of psychedelics. And I know we're in a very strange place with this currently, where it's the hot new trend in the entrepreneurial sort of spiritual crowd to have this discussion about psychedelics. But there's a lot of benefit to be gained from being able to separate and to foster the objectivity necessary to look at things. And mushrooms, or psilocybin, has been very, very helpful to me. MDMA has been very helpful to me, used in controlled settings. But beyond that, just working through and acceptance and really like consistent examining. And for me, like anything else, the practice that has saved me has always been writing.
Yeah, writing's a big one. Do you do like free writing?
I don't. So I know that a lot of people have masturbatory journaling practices, like they, you know, do their pages in the morning. I write to write. I write things that are to be read. I don't have a ton of, like when I need to get introspective, I use it for that, but I'm still like putting it in the context of how is this going to serve other people. And so one of the most popular things I've ever written is I wrote this 7,000 plus word piece on my struggle with depression and suicide. Now that I wrote before I began to publicly speak about the sexual abuse. But it's, my point is that any inkling I have of just journaling to journal about my depression, that's not really there for me. It's there, but it feeds into it's research. It's self-research for something that will eventually be published. For me, nothing's really real until I've written about it, and my writing isn't real until I feel like it can be read and of service to other people. Yeah. And so, my actual journaling, I don't do morning journaling. The whole. I mean, I see value in the way that people do it. It's just not the way I do it. I'm a very Doogie Howser journaler. I do my journaling at the end of the evening, and it is to record the events of the day. And this is what happened. This is what I thought about it. And it's really so that my biographer has things organized whenever whoever this person might be, should there ever be interest in kind of checking the state of mind from the perspective of someone else, it's there and it's organized. So this is what happened and when.
When you were going through all like the bodybuilding stuff and like the vanity and kind of superficially creating all these walls, were you also experiencing the depression and those at the same time?
Ish. I was diagnosed with depression when I was 17 years old. And I got into bodybuilding when I was 20. Between 17 and 26, I had maybe 3 bouts of depression. So there was stuff that was there, and so everything kind of had overlap, but it was not in any way concomitant. I don't think that moving through periods of deep vanity made me more or less likely to experience depression. It would just I had some sort of external focal point, and that was a necessary part of my journey. Yeah. The bodybuilding became important to me as an identity marker. You don't do bodybuilding, you are a bodybuilder. Yeah. And it's this thing that you get to put on and live in. And, as much as it is real and important, that for me, there's also this sort of acknowledgement that I got to hide inside that muscular carapace. It was very much armor.
It's interesting. So, like the Wonder Woman pose and the Amy Cuddy, like, when you're hunched over, it's a depressed position. When you're upright, it's like a proud testosterone goes up, all that stuff. It's interesting when you start thinking about people like in your position where you were nailing all like the physiological markers of like feeling really great. But meanwhile, inside there was like this storm happening.
Sure. But I think it's worth acknowledging that storm was going to be happening regardless. So how much more extreme would that internal tempest have been had I not been hitting those outward poses, right? Because those things, I don't think that they're running in contrast to one another. I do think that there is this very real benefit that I was gaining and being able to tap into from doing all of this stuff, from gaining control, from being in control of my body. Whereas had I not been doing them, the maelstrom of the trauma would have been swirling under the surface regardless. This was one way to mitigate that to whatever extent it could. Yeah. You couldn't cure it, certainly, before there was acknowledgement, but I think it would have been worse without it.
What would you do for when you feel like a depression bout coming on? How does one navigate that?
That's a question for everyone on an individual level. For me, my depressive episodes when I was younger were fewer and further between. They were also less intense, and so they've intensified over the years. They've also changed now. Everyone is different. You never know. A storm is a really good metaphor because you don't know. Some storms, even hurricane to hurricane, some of them are wetter than others. Some of them are windier than others. Some of them are longer than others. Whenever I felt a depressive episode coming on, anytime prior to me being 34, I would just pretend it wasn't coming. I would just do life harder, and I would act happier. I would dig in. It wasn't until I was 34 years old and published that piece on depression that I told anyone in my life. The only people who knew were my therapist, my mother, my one of my friends, and depressives, people who suffer from mental illness. We are some of the finest actors in the world, and so much of having mental illness is pretending you don't have mental illness and putting on this act for people, and you just sort of get committed to that. And as the the clouds form on the horizon and you see things darkening, you just ignore it and you just keep doing the thing. So these days, having acknowledged and taken control of the mental illness, at least in as much as I am very cognizant of when it's coming, the goal now is to minimize the upset to my life. If you know that there is a hurricane on the horizon, you cannot pretend it's not there. Instead, I covered the windows with wood and, batten down the hatches. And that to me means, how can I acknowledge the ways that my life is going to be upset, my lack of productivity, not wanting to go out, not wanting to be social, withdrawing from a lot of my relationships and my interactivity within those. And you just let people know. You put everyone on high alert. This is what's coming. And having those conversations is very difficult, and it became a very important thing over time to be able to do that. And for me, it's what led into my advocacy in terms of mental health and mental illness, and putting that on the internet and just letting everyone know, all of my readers and my followers and whoever else might be interested in looking at my stuff. This is an area of struggle. This is what's happening or is about to happen. And here are the ways that it's going to affect me or has affected me in the past. And, to this day, it's a challenge whenever I'm in the midst of a deep depression. People, at least now people know, because there is a very real change that happens in my, the outward manifestation of me, at least through my my internet presence. I go dark for weeks and people won't hear from me. And so now when that begins to happen, even if it's just because I'm busy, then I start to get the DMs and the emails. Are you okay? What's going on? And that's its own thing.
How is that, getting DMs from strangers saying like, are you okay?
That's fine. I mean, I appreciate the concern, but, and I also,
sometimes like, where is the concern coming from is always like an interesting question. Maybe not always, but it's like, who are these people?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. We have a weird fucking job, everything, like if you're a content creator, if you're an influencer, it's, people DM me and they're like, dude, what's your skincare regimen? Or what books are you reading? Have you watched Umbrella Academy yet? What, I saw this, I recently went and saw Take Back Sunday. It made me think of you. How do these people whom I've never met and to whom I've had with whom I've only had limited interaction on Instagram or Facebook know what my favorite band is or know the things that I'm into? Because we put that out there. Yeah. And so I don't view someone checking in on me with regard to my mental health as any more or less invasive or intimate or interested or interesting than somebody asking what my skincare regimen is. This is the path that we have chosen. This is what we do. We put ourselves out there, and the fact that anyone gives a shit at all is humbling. It's like, how did I get to this place where, and I use humbling literally. When most people say humbling, they mean honored. But it really makes you feel small in a way that, like, maybe people shouldn't care about me, because that's how depressive people act. That's how we think. And so I just try to, meet it with appreciation and gratitude. And it is also sort of, like as a brooder and as sort of a comedic misanthrope in that way that all depressed people tend to view the world in all of its absurdity. It's also funny to me. I'm just like, sometimes it's like, guys, I'm just busy. I'm cool. It's not like, not every time I'm off Instagram for a week am I going to kill myself. Yeah. But yeah, it's I appreciate it. It's interesting, because getting annoyed about it or feeling any negative way about it doesn't do anything for me. But the most important thing is that for every DM I get that might make me feel uncomfortable with this veritable stranger asking after my personal mental health, I get 10 from strangers thanking me for helping with theirs. And if that's the price, if that's the ratio, then I'm more than okay with it, because I get DMs and emails all the time from people who say thank you for writing the things that you've written, or the depression piece helped me understand my father who suffers from depression, or my partner. And most of the emails and DMs are, I would say historically, most of them are not from people who they themselves suffer, but for people who know people who suffer.
Yeah.
And that is gratifying.
As you were talking before, there's a Rumi quote, like the cure for the pain is in the pain. And there's a bunch of people that quote like similar things like that. Like going into the pain is oftentimes that's where the answers are. But I feel like we kind of got fucked up by like The Secret and the laws of attraction and manifestation and all that.
Yeah.
Because I feel that myself. I just did a month-long thing where we were like introspecting and doing all sorts of weird stuff. And a part of that was going into like these dark parts and your fears and the things that you never want to think about. And I have all sorts of shit like that because I've been like secreting myself into like positivity.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh no, like there's still these festering corners in there.
Right.
You say around 34, you started exploring those parts?
Yeah. I mean, well, they were hidden from me, but I mean, I will say in general that if you look at sort of the difference between New York and LA, I'm a brooding, cynical, pragmatic New Yorker. And anyone who says positive vibes only is, I think, immediately available for a punch in the face and deserving of it.
I think that's fair.
And, so it's like from well ahead of my uncovering or my acknowledgement of all of the trauma, I still, was very much, not encouraging everyone to like fall into their, brooding narcissist sort of expression of themselves. But I do think that, false positivity is really dangerous. I think that putting out this incredible, just like, we're just like, you can choose happiness. No, I mean, maybe you can't choose happiness at all. Maybe you have something wrong in your fucking brain, and being happy is like the hardest thing you can do. Maybe, I think it diminishes and invalidates, or at least marginalizes, mental illness. I think that there's a lot of, I think that people have good intentions. I just think that they're completely unaware of anything outside their own experience. And it's a type of privilege. And people don't realize that not having mental illness is a privilege. They don't. And so when you have like healthy brain privilege, it's the same thing as white privilege. Doesn't mean your life was easy. It just means it wasn't made harder by your natural brain chemistry. And, in the same way that, white privilege, it doesn't mean that your life was easy. It doesn't mean you didn't face challenges. It just means that this color of your skin wasn't one of them. Mm-hmm. And like people don't want to unpack and acknowledge that. And the same thing with, it's really hard to see, people who have all the privilege in the world and to just talk about positive vibes only. It's like, the world isn't actively trying to fucking, hurt you. Yeah. And in the case of someone like myself who presents outwardly as a straight white male, the world is pretty much set up for my success. And I can acknowledge that cognitively, but when I'm in the midst of the depression and, there's this paranoia that the universe was created specifically to find a way to cause pain in my life. And that's, there's this like weird underlying sort of arrogance and narcissism. It's like everything in the world exists to cause me pain and to make me hurt and to make me hate myself, which is something you can only like really even get to with a lot of therapy and introspection and I think psychedelics. So, well in advance of me ever acknowledging any of this, there's always been a very great resistance to this projected positivity ideology that is so prevalent on Instagram, and in particular in LA.
Yeah, totally.
And to me, it's there's very few things. I take again, I'm a pragmatist, and I think that like in general, I would rather have deal with someone who has slightly undeserving arrogance than someone who has obviously false humility, because it's just infinitely more tolerable. And by the same token, I would rather deal with someone who has an unjustifiably dour outlook on life than one that is unjustifiably positive.
Yeah.
Or at least if they're going to espouse that and put that out on the internet.
It's interesting how to use Freud's terms, the super ego, or the kind of the consciousness, the zeitgeist kind of chooses what's appropriate for us to express versus what's not. Mm-hmm. And so your sexuality and your penis and your anus, and there's we just don't talk about that, And there's certain emotions. It's the same thing. We don't talk about that. We just do more pictures of us being awesome. And then, but at the same time, when you shut that stuff down, it just ends up festering and becoming more toxic. It's super fucking ironic that we these things that they need the most care, but the culture ends up kind of by design shadowing those spots.
Yeah.
Was there any things that you did specifically to start to open some of those parts up, say around the depression, around sexuality?
No, I mean, for me, it's, the darkness has always been the draw, once you have an acknowledgement of it. So the depressive stuff, the more that I lived it, the more I lived in it. And then once I started talking about it, it's what I wanted to talk about because I saw that it was helping people and I wanted to destigmatize it. So I think that the way that other people can get into that part of themselves is to interact with the people who are already doing that. And I think that that's where community helps so much.
Yeah, it's huge.
Of all the things that have helped me in depression, I've been very, very lucky that I have so many people in my life. They're they're there for you and they want to help you and everything. But the thing that helps the most is just and I really hate to fall back on such maxims on misery loves company. But I think that, pain loves understanding is really what it is. Pain craves understanding, deep understanding, empathy. And for me, the thing that has been the most helpful is being able to discuss my depression with other people who suffer from depression. Having a 10-minute conversation with a person who also suffers from mental illness is more helpful to me in terms of being seen and heard and loved and helped and understood than 10 hours of conversation with someone who does not themselves suffer. It's just very much, maybe I lack the language, or maybe I just have a block with my ability to recognize empathy from a person who doesn't have that same experiential access. But at the end of the day, I just think that, commiseration is the deepest form of conversation with regard to mental illness.
How did you get into the writing stuff? Being such a passion of yours.
I was a writer before I was anything else. I've always been a writer. It was when I was a kid and there was abuse in the house, reading and writing were my escapes. It was the thing that I could always do. It's so interesting that I notice this now. This is a very strange comparison, but I'll loop back around and make it make sense. I noticed that as a writer and, as someone who is always taking notes on the world, if I have a notebook and someone says something interesting and I just start writing, when I'm in a conversation with someone, and this is going to sound a little weird, so I will loop back around. Whenever I'm out with someone and, if someone says something interesting or I just want to write something down, if I have a notebook and I start taking notes, nobody says anything. But if you, and this is just another piece of the social enforcement of norms that people think that they are trying to make you a better person. If I'm having a conversation with someone and I take out my phone and I start typing on it, it could be to take those same notes, but there's something about looking at a screen and being involved in it in some way where people find that very offensive, or they think for whatever reason that you're not paying them mind. Whereas if you do it on a with pen and paper, then it is totally okay. They almost feel happy about it. And so when I was a child, I had 2 ways to entertain myself. There was reading and writing, and then there were video games. And when I was young and there was, all this screaming and fighting and dish breaking and all this shit happening in my house, there was this behavior around video games. Like if I wanted to escape from what was happening and I played Zelda and I just wanted to be there, it was treated as though I was not honoring the horror that was happening around me. How can you play video games at a time like this? My sister would be upset with me. My parents would come in and yell at me. They would take that away because things are happening and you're seeking recreation. When what I was seeking was escape. And so, but reading, if they come in and find you reading a book, it's like, well, even in the midst of this insanity and this pandemonium, he is trying to find a way to educate himself in some way. That was lauded. And so as a child, reading and writing were escapes that were never taken from me. They were never criticized. They were always, I always had access to them. And so I've been a writer my entire life. And when I was 8 years old, I told my mother I wanted to write a book. When she asked me why, I said, because books make me happy and I want to make other people happy as well. And then throughout my life, I just kept writing and writing. And so it's not as though, I think that there are some people who still labor under the delusion that I was this fitness guy and then I decided or found passion in writing. No, for me, I've always been a writer, and I have always written about the thing about which I am passionate about at any given moment. And if it hadn't been fitness, it would have been something else. It just happened to be fitness because that was something that I found and a passion I developed, and it seemed easy for me to write about. And every time I wrote about it, it made me more and more successful. So I did that.
How does one cultivate their voice in the writing?
Your voice is you. And then it really begins to, if we really want to go deep with this, and I feel like this is a place where we can do that, it's asking yourself, what is you? What are the things that make you who you are? And, we won't go to the absolute top level of spirituality and just say like, you are this being that has always been and will always be. But in terms of like who you, the human, is, you are an aggregate, a conglomeration of whatever base genetic material was granted and created at your inception, and then your consciousness run through all of the experiences that you've ever had. So everything, every memory specifically, but also everything you've ever read, every movie you've seen, every conversation you've had, every song you've listened to, this all becomes canon and gets, indelibly burned into you in some way. And then all of these ingredients interact. The consciousness that you have at this very moment is going to take what I say in this conversation, and that'll get filtered in some way, and that will interact with all of the other ingredients and memories that you have accrued over the course of your life. And then you will come out of this conversation being 0.00001% different than you were. And then tomorrow you'll have a different conversation. All of this gets factored in. Every conversation, every book, everything. Your voice as a writer is that's you. And it's, you imagine it as a lens. And so whatever thought you have and want to put down on paper gets pushed through that lens. And depending on your level of control over it, you can focus it to make it so strong it could burn a hole through wood, or you can make it more kaleidoscopic where it can splay a rainbow across a wall. And all of that already lives inside you. And now what you need to do, like anything else, is harness it, learn how to manipulate and adjust it, and that takes practice. And the way that you do that is reading great writers and understanding the breakdown of the tools and modalities. Writing and reading and talking are things that we have to do in our day-to-day society. And so can I mention your book?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
writing and reading and talking are things that we have to do in our day-to-day society. It's part of how we function. And in your book, the draft of which you were kind enough to show me, you mentioned breathing and nasal breathing. And you talked about how we take between 16,000 and 20,000 breaths per day. And we don't think about most of these. It's this sort of automatic thing that's happening, right? That's just, being regulated by our nervous system. It's just words are the same way. We just go throughout our day reading words whenever they pop up. You're driving down the street and there are street signs, and some part of your brain is registering them. You have a conversation with someone like this. You're not picking the words. So there's all that stuff happening. And I always liken it to music. If every single person is making music, then a person who is capable of walking around the world, having conversations and reading and writing, etc., is at the very least capable, in musical terms, of sitting down at a campfire and strumming out Kumbaya and a couple of other songs. Some of us who have dedicated ourselves to becoming better at communication can play a lot of different songs. We can play other different, we can maybe write our own songs. But if you really want to get good, if you really want to become a great musician, at some point it's not enough to just practice. You have to study music theory. You have to educate yourself on the specific language of this modality, because we know good music when we hear it. We know beauty when we see it. Our brains are wired to appreciate visual symmetry and sonic melody, and in the same way, our brains are wired to appreciate good writing, the flow of the language, the beauty of the words themselves and the order in which they fall, the rhythm and the meter. And most people don't know why writing is good. They just know good writing. They know the difference between good writing and bad. And even people who are not particularly focused on it will read bad writing and they're like, oh, okay, whatever. But when they read good writing, they become aware of it. It's like, oh, that's something special. And that is the first step. Educating yourself on the tool sets and really diving back into everything between 3rd and 8th grade, where you learned grammar and morphology and syntax, and seeing that these are amazing tools where you can invert sentences and clauses, and the way that you end a sentence doesn't have to be the same every time, and you can use punctuation to establish tempo. And when you begin to do that and understand how these things are used, in the same way that somebody can begin to understand how to produce music by learning about tempo and beats, that's how you begin to really figure out what your voice is. Every musician who has ever created a song, that's their that's their musical voice, even if it's not their actual vocal, if it's just their production or their instrument. It's the way that you view the world put on paper, pushed through the lens of your experience, and it happens to be the thing about which you're writing.
Is there any standout kind of like faults that you see in people's writings? Like in movement, there's like obvious things like everybody's doing this thing. If we just stop doing that, is there anything that's like a few standouts?
Yes, but it's not everybody. It depends on where you came in. And in much the same way that if you work with someone who is a former bodybuilder versus someone who is a former gymnast, they will present with different movement dysfunction, perhaps.
Right. Yeah.
People who are my parents' generation, or even people who went to Catholic school and are my age, they learned grammar. People my age learned something called phonics, and millennials brought up learning something called whole language. So those are the 3 primary schools of writing instruction in the States. And each of those has sort of inherent, I don't want to say strengths and weaknesses, but each of those is taught a certain way, and you will come out of it having focused on different things. People who grew up learning grammar, there is a structure that you're taught, and it's drilled into your head, and so deviating from it becomes difficult. And so writing in a way that sounds like you is more challenging because you have to deviate, Whereas people on the other side of that, far other side of that spectrum, who learned whole language, they were brought up not only learning a more I-centric, the letter I-centric way of writing, they also grew up in the age of the internet. And that is very much, whereas grammar is very much never use the letter I, always write from a neutral perspective. The whole language is pretty much the opposite of that. So their issue, the people who learned whole language, their issue is more grammatical and structural. Like they don't know where the commas go. Right. And that is simply how that presents for them, and how that expression will be based on their level of formal education or the type of formal education that they received. So I would say that it is not specifically everyone doing X, Y, or Z. It's that depending on their entry point, they are more likely to present with a given sort of process, and that process may have holes in it versus others. The real issue that I see that's more universal is the lack of attention to writing, particularly in the age of the influencer. And as we are on Instagram and everyone wants pretty pictures, positivity notwithstanding, there is a push, particularly in the entrepreneurial community, toward video, and you have to do video, and you have to have a podcast like this. And all of those things are temporary. They're not in the way that everything is temporary, and the existence, that we get to experience is but a moment in the grand scheme of existence. But technology and anything that is reliant on it for production has obsolescence built into it, and that is just the way that the world works. And so when people are focused very much on video, they're ignoring the fact that how they're filming that video is representative of the moment in which it's being filmed. And that means the technology that they're using to film it, but also the way that video is filmed right then. Right now in 2009 YouTube, it's a lot of hard cuts. Everybody's using drones for aerial shots. And when you watch something from 5 years ago, it's not like that. And so if your audience, if people in general, if the masses are being conditioned, everyone is biased towards new content. We all want new, right? And so if you put on YouTube and you see that something is filmed differently, you'll automatically know, like, oh, this is from 2011. Yep. People might be less likely to watch it. In the same way, if you put on a movie from the 80s, like the quality of the film is different. The way that things are filmed are different. Do you remember, like, there's that whole in a world joke. You see movie trailers now, nobody says in a world. There's no voiceover for movie trailers. The way that movie trailers are produced currently is very different. There are trends. And so the mistake that people are making is they are focusing entirely too much on something which is formulaic and trend-based, whereas writing is elemental and eternal. We are still reading Hemingway. People still read the Bible. Everybody still wants to write a book. And it's because this is the stuff that does not go away. If you were to ask 100 of the most respected movie critics in the world to name their top 5 pictures of all time, The Godfather would appear on 100 lists. Maybe some at number 1, some at number 5, but there would be 100% consensus that The Godfather is one of the top 5 films ever made. You agree with that statement?
Yeah, I'm on board with that.
Okay.
I have to think about it a little bit more, honestly, but yeah, I could go with that.
Do you agree that most movie critics would put it on their list?
Yeah, I would agree with that part for sure.
Okay. Yeah. So whether or not you and I think The Godfather is one of the top 5 films ever made, we could acknowledge that the consensus from those people whose job it is to rate movies would be that it is one of the top 5. Now, if someone who had never seen that movie and who has no context for it, if you were to just show them that movie, it would be difficult to focus on the story and the incredible storytelling and acting and direction and writing of The Godfather, because you would be focused on your ability to see makeup caked on Al Pacino's face. Right. Because a movie shot in 1977 shown on even a 4K phone in 2019, it's a vastly different experience. The same thing, in 1975, Jaws was the scariest film ever made. Beach attendance dropped 50% for 5 years.
That was filmed out here, right?
Yeah. So a movie comes out in 1975, and then between 1975 and 1980, beach attendance drops 50 years because of this film about a shark. It's well acted, well directed, well scored, well written. But now, if you were to watch Jaws, it's laughable because the technology has surpassed. The technology of today is so far ahead of the technology of 1975 that you see the rubber shark. You see how it's a rubber shark. And so because of that, you can't be scared. It's laughable. It's ridiculous. You show Jaws to a 12-year-old, and it's ridiculous. They're down with the Meg, starring Jason Statham, who is a badass, admittedly. Not a great movie, but he is a badass. Yeah. But if you read Jaws now, it's still terrifying. If you read The Godfather, it's still one of the greatest stories ever told. If you read The Exorcist, it's still terrifying, whereas if you watch it now and you see the herky-jerky nature with which this head is supposed to turn around, and you see that the pea soup is not being vomited up but is actually coming from this wire that is just out of frame, this tube, it's hard to be afraid of those things. It's hard to be afraid. But when you read it, it's not. The writing is elemental and eternal, and that is the thing. That's the mistake that everyone is making, that I see, quote, everybody making. It's me. It's my job, my vision, my quest to help people understand that all of these things are completely ephemeral. It's temporary. The way that you're making videos right now will change. 5 years from now, people might not want all these hard cuts. They might think that drones are cheesy. They might think that it's that people filming these Instagram stories in their car while they're driving is absolutely absurd. Right. But the written word, that's forever. That's the thing. And so the mistake I see people making with the writing is not writing, and not focusing on it, and not getting better at it.
As you were talking about the difference, the contrast, and we'll wrap up soon because you gotta wrap up. Oh, we gotta wrap up right now.
I got about 5 minutes.
All right, yeah. So just an interesting idea popped up that I don't know that I've ever really pondered on, but how much our language, which is silly because we should be pondering on this, but how much our language and our writing affects the way that we think and the psychology
absolutely.
of the culture. Absolutely,
yes. The words that we use, words mean things, and the words that we use. This is one of the most important. I'll since we're going to close soon, I'll close with this.
Yeah.
One of the questions I always ask whenever I lead a writing workshop or I'm on stage somewhere is I ask people, what do you think is more important, actions or words? Now, invariably, somebody says actions because they take the bait. And obviously actions are important. But if I were to ask you, what's your name?
Aaron.
I want you to tell me what your name is in actions. I want you to tell me where you're from in actions. I want you to explain your worldview. I want you to explain everything that's in your book, everything that's important to you. But I want you to do it solely in actions. You can't do that. Everything that makes you who you are exists in your brain. And the real thing that differentiates humanity from the rest of the animal kingdom, and there are very few things, like if you've ever been able to sort of detach from what's going on around yourself, if you've been at like a nightclub and you're just sort of watching this mating ritual of, it's very similar to watching like primates dance around a fire.
Very similar.
And it's just, it's this thing that animals have been doing forever. But, then we add conversation to it, and that's what changes. That's the thing that makes everything unique and special to humanity. It's the fact that we have thoughts in words, and we can transmit them, and there's a universality to it, where we can make scratches, we can put symbols in dirt or on paper or on a wall, and then we don't have to be there, and someone else could look at those symbols and know exactly what we meant, because that's what a written language is. That's what it is to have a record of something. And the words everything that makes you who you are, Aaron, exists in your brain and in your heart. But the only way that you can put it out into the world in a way that like helps me understand definitively is when you speak it. Now, obviously, an argument can be made for, you know, music or visual arts, but I'm just talking in like everyday interaction with people. And so words they're the thing that make us capable of expressing who we are. Not to mention actions are almost always reactions. Most people are living in a reactive state. And so when when people say things like actions speak louder than words, it's very much like people condemning other people's mistakes and everything, and like, you know, how there's an incongruence between the things that you say and the things that you do. Now, I believe that we should all be aiming for congruence. We should all have alignment between our words and our actions. But I would posit, and this is something that I've come through therapy and come through my use of psychedelics and come through deep self-work. When there is misalignment, when there's incongruence between the words that people say and the actions that they take, that incongruence is because there is a reaction. Their actions are a reaction to something else. The words, their intentions that they speak, that is their expression of their highest self, their hope for who they can be, their hope for the thing that they want to be able to do and the way that they want to be able to show up. And their action, if it doesn't match that, it's usually a reaction, and it's usually because the action shows where they are right now, and their words are where they want to be. And that when there is that incongruence, certainly that can hurt people because there is a misalignment, but it should show that that's the place that needs to be worked on, that's the area where you need to advance as a person, that you need to do the work and the healing, because we want you to get to the point where there is alignment between your words and actions so that your actions can be representative of your highest place. I can ask you what your position is on violence, and you could say, like, you're generally a nonviolent person, but if someone punches you in the face, your reaction to that will probably be violence. And so, you know, your actions are reactions to something else. Another thing I would say is that when you sort of look at outcomes, words inspire actions moving forward. You can say things and set action into motion. Actions really only go backwards. People talk about your actions after the fact. Words can move actions forward into the future. They're the thing that words and thoughts drive things into the future. And then finally, if you're looking for a soundbite, and I think that this is really important, your actions give people something to talk about. Your words give them something to think about.
I love it, man. I really appreciate all this resistance that you've persevered or in the process of working with in your life. It's like crafted some good stuff.
I'm working through it every day.
I appreciate
every day.
it.
Thank you.
Where's the best place to point people? What's
Sure.
exciting now?
For those interested in my ramblings and meanderings, johnromanello.com is the central hub for everything that I do, and there you will find my articles, my essays, and access to everything else. But if you are looking to interact directly, I encourage you to follow me on Instagram, where I am not nearly as consistent posting narcissistic photos of myself as I should be, but I am fun on Instagram stories. And if you have any questions about writing or anything that we've spoken about today, please feel very free to slide into my DMs. I am always happy to procrastinate on work to have a conversation with a total stranger.
Perfect. Thank you, brother.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Again. All right, over now. Thank you all so much for tuning into that conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I am super excited to present to you guys the Align Method online program, which focuses on unwinding some of the deleterious effects of essentially staring into technology. So forward head posture, rolled forward shoulders, and just general collapsy postural patterns, and also gets into a movement guide and how to integrate better movement into your life. So you can check that out at alignpodcast.com/align method, ALIGN podcast.com/align Align Method, or you can find it at the Instagram page, Align Podcast, in the bio. Thank you to the folks that have grabbed the Align band, heavy duty resistance band with a door anchor and a free video guide that goes with it. So you can actually just access the free video guide if you want, just to get resistance band exercise in general. It's at alignband.com, ALIGN band.com. All right. Thanks guys so much for tuning in. Appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of your day.